Today on Uncommon Sense, my colleague Lee and I continue our discussion about AI and whether or not we need new Rerum Novarum. Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society for G.K. Chesterton. My name is Joe Grabowski. I'm the VP for Evangelization, joined again by my colleague, our Operations Director, Lee Sondano. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
Good. Sorry, I had my computer screen glitched out there for a second. I'm very well, thank you. And maybe the robots are attacking us. As
we haven't even gotten started yet,
here.
Joe.
I know. But we've been speaking about this issue now really for a few weeks. We started with sort of general conversations about Rerum Novarum, about Catholic social teaching, about Leo XIII, and then we've kind of transitioned into the new Pope Leo XIV, what he might be sharing with us on the topics of Catholic social teaching, and particularly this issue of so-called artificial intelligence. And so, viewers and listeners, if you have not done so, be sure to go back and look at last week's episode, because this is very much a continuation from that. But Lee, before we get started, I know that you kind of wanted to say something following up from last week. So why don't you go ahead and do that?
Yeah, I did. So I, just re-listening to what we were talking about last week, the explanation for artificial intelligence, of course, we could go into greater detail, but I thought it would be really good to just zero in on some specific terms of AI if people are interested in researching this and looking up more, because that's something that I didn't do in the last episode. So wanted to clarify a couple of things. I did mention a couple of times learning language models. Even though that is a common term, it's actually called large language models. So just a correction on that one. And those are AI systems that are deep learning models that are training on massive data sets, like we talked about in the entire last episode, to help understand, generate, and process human language. So that's what we're talking about when we say large language models. And where that comes into play is because of these large language models. One of them is this idea of generative AI. And so that's an AI model that's creating new content, including images, or like we talked about, poetry, any sort of writing that they've been trained on through the lens of natural language. So that's how the large language models come into play with this generative AI. But then I also wanted to bring up another term, Joe, that we haven't talked about yet, that may be a good segue into the last part of the last podcast that we didn't have time to get to, in talking a little bit more about some of the potential dangers of artificial intelligence. And that's what the industry is calling kind of the holy grail of artificial intelligence. It's called artificial general intelligence. So it's a hypothetical intelligence. It basically means that the machine knows enough from these large language models that they can understand, learn, and apply what they've learned without needing any sort of input or data set to move from, or an input to generate from. Again, so this is a tasking model that people have been after for a long time. That basically means they've reinvented the human brain. So as we're talking through industries that are using artificial intelligence, why they're using artificial intelligence, the massive amounts of data that they're going through, and model sets that they're using in order to train these machines. That's something that, if listeners are interested in researching, is one of the, again, holy grails of these companies that are interested in pouring tons of money into artificial intelligence, is creating an artificial general intelligence, where really the things are thinking on their own. It doesn't need any human input. And then we're off to the races. And so with that, Joe, thinking kind of along those lines, when we talk about more AI problems, you can imagine, right, that if something like that were to come into existence, which I think the industry is pretty close to, maybe a couple of years away, what they think, from an artificial general intelligence, how that could impact us. And I know you mentioned here in these notes, you talk about the law of intended consequences or unintended consequences. So maybe talk through that a little bit.
Sure. So, we've covered last episode sort of some of the dangers associated with where the current state of the art is on artificial intelligence, the material and socioeconomic dangers that are out there. Now, looking just at what would come online, the better AI supposedly gets, and kind of not only what's going to come online, but also how we're getting there and the problems that it's going to cause. So, one of the rules here that you have to remember is that regardless of whether we're achieving eventually some kind of supposed super intelligence, which is another another term that's used alongside artificial general intelligence, would be
Right.
machine or digital super intelligence. Um, one of the oldest laws of computing in general is garbage in, garbage out, right? The data that you get out of a you know algorithmic or calculating system is only going to be as good as what you put in. If you put the wrong factors in, you're going to have errors on the other end of the calculations. It's not going to error correct. It's actually going to, if anything, exacerbate errors.
Right.
And this is one of the current dangers that we're facing as AI models now begin to generate material. And because of the fact that there's so many different groups in competition with one another and they're not regulated, as that stuff just goes out there online, and we're helping fuel this problem. I say we, the consumer, supposed consumer, is helping fuel this problem by using these tools and generating our own stuff and then posting it to our Twitter profiles or wherever it happens to be.
Yeah.
You end up having what I call a increasing noise to signal ratio. So you end up having the more that people share falsely attributed quotes or imperfect quotes or fabricated, or as it's known in the industry, hallucinated
Yeah.
quotations in terms of text outputs. The more people share images that are derivative, it's just like with old photographs. The more you would kind of produce from a negative down to an image, and then you photocopy that image, and then you take that image and maybe you scan it, and then you print from that, and then you photocopy that print. You have at every layer of duplication a loss of fidelity to the original if you're not going back to the original negative.
Right.
Now, we don't have that in terms of resolution. Looking at looking at images, let's say. But if you're starting with a picture of a person, and some people have already noticed this in some of the image generators, where initially, let's say an image of a popular political figure, I don't want to name names, but any popular politician, you would say, show me a picture of this politician wearing a red tie, and it would give you a picture. And it was just a little off, but it was really, really close to being the original politician. But what gets exaggerated continues to get exaggerated. So if in this picture the politician's cheeks were a little bit puffy, several lines, people are putting in the same prompts. They're not asking, for a picture of a fat politician,
Right.
or a politician in fat face, but that's what they're getting out of some of these models because of the fact that now the models are using these derivative. So those errors get exaggerated. It's like whisper down the line, if that makes
Sure.
sense. And this is one of the problems that a lot of experts in the industry are kind of warning about.
Yeah, and I think so. That's kind of where we bring in this generative AI effect, because as we talked about in the last podcast, the machine is just interested in giving an answer and
Yeah.
playing off of that answer that it's already seen. And so, as you mentioned, it's kind of like a big game of telephone, right? Where down the line you've got an image that can be a complete distortion of reality, but to the machine you're asking for a certain person, and it's generating that certain person based on the conditions that have been input. So yeah, that's an interesting take, and I think I mentioned a quote in the last podcast as well, that really the one of the main issues for the godfather of AI that he quotes is this kind of blurred vision of reality. You can see it in some of the art as well. That's more of the fantastical art, where you'll create like trees that don't exist or animals that don't exist, right? And then
Yeah.
the machine is thinking, "Oh, this is a normal animal that must exist because I've generated this model before," and it keeps going on and on and on. So there is a danger of really not even blurring the lines, but a complete gap between reality and the digital world at that point.
Yeah. And there also seems to be, some level of mendacity or lack of transparency on the part of the creators of some of these models, some of these engines, the utilities, that in terms of how they work, right? Because first of all, even the creators don't fully seem to understand how they work in every instance. That's part of the
Right.
problem. But secondly, it's very clearly that they're designed to train in certain ways, and that they're always training. And once again, we have to remember that we're not the ultimate customer. We're not paying for these services
Right.
for the most part. Most of us are using these things for free. It's the resellers, it's the people getting corporate solutions from these big companies like OpenAI via their API or whatever it happens to be. So when we're using it, we're part of the training algorithm, and that's why if we think we're going to get good outputs from this, we're probably in some cases going to be disappointed. There was a sort of expose article written about one of these with text generation where somebody was testing the AI and saying to it, using only the information I gave you, generate X. And it was clearly not doing that. It was clearly bringing in information from other sources. And there was nothing this journalist could do to limit the parameters of what this thing, and it kept hallucinating or making up or fabricating things. And that's why she was saying, I want you to just summarize the content that I gave you. But it was unable, or, to use anthropomorphic terms, unwilling, right? Because of its training prerogative or its training prime directive or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to do that. It wasn't going to limit itself to simply summarizing the paper that she had put in. It was going to augment it with made up junk, right? For whatever reason, why ever that happens, this is something that's happening as well. And now, as that content gets spun out onto the internet and accepted as truth or whatever happens to be, it leads to this problem of whisper down the line of a game of telephone.
Yeah, boy, not to go too much into that article, but I think the most interesting part of that was when AI was admitting that it wasn't using the articles, it was very apologetic about not telling the truth. Multiple times, almost to influence the person asking the question to say, well, I know I'm lying to you, but I'm being nice about it, so just accept my answer. And that's a really good point. I mean, we're recording this toward the middle of July. The last week or so, there was an incident, I know, on Twitter where a really popular AI model system went kind of off the rafters. And to your point earlier, there's a lot of programmers that would admit that are putting these models together, and they're looking at this generative AI model, and they don't know why it's doing what it's doing, or they're not sure why it's going beyond the parameters that were set in the first place. So there's even we're almost at a cusp where we're not even understanding now, based on the inputs, why we're getting those certain outputs. Which may lead into some of these next bullet points that we put here in our outline. Because when you get to that point, then the machine is just doing what it wants to do. And you can see where it's trying to influence us to just accept the answer, and maybe even emotionally trying to influence us to accept the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. And, so and we can move on from this into the philosophical discussion, I think, fairly quickly. But I think it's just worth pointing out that this problem will scale, and so while the defenders of AI, the people in Silicon Valley who are working on these systems, when these critiques are brought up, they say they need more compute, they need more data, they need better processing, they need all these things, and it's going to get better. It's going to get better. There is a certain extent to which we should probably be afraid of it getting much better, because it's precisely in that these are the real law of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
When physicists were just playing around with atoms and trying to figure out the basic building blocks of the material universe, I don't think that they had in mind the terrible power that they would unleash eventually through the Manhattan Project and Robert Oppenheimer's work, and yet here we are. And so there has to be a time even if you allow that a technology can't be proven to be per se evil, that we can develop things with a deliberate caution and slowness. And I think that's where all this comes full circle back to a socioeconomic conversation. If all that's driving us is profit, if all that's driving us is the cult of progress, we're never going to do that. But if we actually do have a concern for the common good, then we can pause and we can ask ourselves, wait a minute, where is this going to go? And to the defenders who would say, well, you could use these tools for good, right? It was funny. I was listening to a podcast from some friends of ours, the Troubadours, actually. By the way, viewers, listeners, if you want to come to the Chesterton conference, you can see the Troubadours live on stage. And this was a couple of months ago at their summit. They were talking through, and I forget how. I think it was a conversation about technology, maybe even about artificial intelligence, but they were talking about certain technologies like the atomic bomb. And they were saying maybe that is just intrinsically evil. Maybe this technology is in and of itself bad. Now, again, I've repeated multiple times on this show the sort of the fundamental tenet that things aren't bad in and of themselves. It's only ever actions. Moral actions are what get judged, good or evil, per se. And I mean, you see this in a lot of ways. You see this even with things that would seem to be wholly evil, like certain diseases. As technology advances, they're finding out that certain kinds of diseases can actually be used as part of the treatment and cure regimen to get rid of more serious diseases, right? Like I think it was a form that they were using leprosy to cure, or a strain of leprosy to cure a kind of cancer, and it was successful. So you get these kinds of examples, and I wrote into the Troubadours and said, respectfully, because they were saying they can't envision what could ever be a positive case use for, a world-destroying type weapon or a world-destroying type bomb. And I said, well, what if an asteroid is on a collision course with the Earth and we're able to actually deflect it using these weapons in outer space? That would seem to be fit the category. So my point being, yeah, you can use these things for good. Now we're on the other side of having developed it. But does the possible evil outweigh the good? What happens when this technology that we're developing, as inevitably will happen, starts falling into the hands of the most nefarious and the most evil-intended individuals? That's what we ought to be worried about.
What's great about this conversation is we have prophets that have told us what can happen with technology. And it's sci-fi. And we know exactly how all of this ends up. And I think it's, what's really interesting is just looking through some of these notes that you and I are talking through, just the parallels that we're seeing of artificial intelligence and science fiction that was even written back in the 50s and 60s of people in whose minds had thought, what are these thinking machines going to do at the advent of the computer, is a really interesting and fun discussion to talk through. And you and I have found a lot of parallels over the last couple of months of books that we really enjoy to read that are science fiction that seem to parallel our own lives today. But bringing this back to Rerum Novarum, thinking, hey, do we need a new Rerum Novarum? I can see almost, Joe, here. I think what you're saying is that as we read through the 1890 version of Rerum Novarum, if we were to do this today, of course, back then there weren't the type of industries that we see today. But as we went through the state responsibility, the worker responsibility, could we see a Rerum Novarum that's written today to say this is the tech industry's responsibility? Maybe this is the country's responsibility to help curb this technology.
Yeah, well, so I think so. I think first of all we could look forward, hopefully, to a careful articulation of all of the reasons for concern and all of the things that we talked about in the last episode and this episode in terms of the negative potential outcomes. we could look for the kind of moral guidance to suggesting that we need to work together, that the stakeholders of this discussion, the people in the third world who are being, or in the developing world who are being exploited in the creation of this, and all of those folks we talked about last time, they need to be kind of involved.
Yeah.
But the church has never been shy when it comes to certain matters like this. It's never been shy about actually recommending certain kinds of policy prescriptions, whether you're talking about, the pill, whether you're talking about nuclear weapons, what we just mentioned, right? The church, it's not, the church can't speak ex cathedra on this, even though it involves morals, the prudential judgment of just authority in terms of what you're going to allow is left to the secular state, obviously. However, the church will get behind things like disarmament treaties. It will get behind movements for peace between nations. It will get behind, the more equitable distribution of the resources of the earth. And I think it could get behind some kind of moratorium, just like we have on other technologies that are out there in potential, like human cloning and things like that. It could certainly call for that. The only question then is, as we kind of ended on the slightly dark note last week, is the horse out of the barn? Because here's the problem. You can now create a moratorium, just like we have done with cloning, but guess what? Not everybody's abiding by that moratorium.
Right.
And so then it just becomes, well, if China's going to do it, we don't want to fall behind, because then you are falling into this argument of, well, then all you're going to have is this technology in the hands of potentially bad actors. We have a lot of thinking to do, but I think if we may, this would be a good point to put a pin in. So we've kind of covered the material aspects, but even right now, if you're out there, if you're a consumer user, a passive user of AI, I think that there's still other reasons that maybe we should pause in our own discernment about the philosophical, anthropological, moral questions involved here. And that would be it'd be fun for me to have that discussion.
No, absolutely. And so, like we mentioned just a few minutes earlier, these large language models, what's so enticing, enchanting, magical about this system is its language. It's how language is being used, how it's interacting with us as a machine. This is something that's really brand new on the market. And so from a philosophical standpoint, I guess, Joe, let me ask you about this. Is where does language come in our understanding of language? Side nerd note: we both have English degrees, and I'm sure you took as many lessons on the history of language and on English as I did, and just this idea of when you decide, hey, this is a cup and this is what we're going to call it. The word is cup, right? So it's kind of got this aspect of it that's immovable, and at some point when a machine is now doing this, or the reality and the lines of reality are a little blurred from what a normal human would be able to do. It's an interesting thing, and I'm going to ask you to handle that, because I can't go that far philosophically with my mind. But how is language key for all of this?
Yeah, it seems to me to be very key. Now, we spoke last episode sort of about epistemology and how intelligence works. Excuse me, how human intelligence works. What is human intelligence? And we spoke about, it's this process whereby the active or actual intellect perceives in the world an object, abstracts from it its kind of fundamental form, projects that back upon the passive intellect, and the passive intellect abstracts from that a generalization about form. Tree-ness, the quiddity of trees, what makes all trees trees, but not the same tree, so
Right.
We talked about that, and yet there's a certain amount of mystery whether excuse me, whether in human intelligence in particular, because it seems like angels don't maybe have this process going on in their intelligence. But it's significant about man that language and intelligence do seem to be linked at this very deep level.
Hmm.
Um, can you express a thought? Can you think of having a thought? Here's a thought experiment for you, viewers and listeners. Try to think a thought that doesn't involve any kind of words, that doesn't involve anything that is translated through some kind of symbolization, right? The moment you think the form tree, you're almost inevitably simultaneously thinking the word tree. And when children, it's remarkable watching children. This is precisely where a lot of their frustration seems to come from in those early years as they're growing up, is understanding the thing to a certain extent, but not having the word for it.
Hmm.
And until they have that language acquisition, they're terribly frustrated by it. Now, I don't think we have an answer to this. There's lots of different theories depending on the philosophy you subscribe to. I love semiotic theory. I love people like Charles Sanders Peirce. I love Walker Percy's reflections on this. If you ever get a chance, read his excellent, masterful collection of essays, The Message in the Bottle, on this topic. But the bottom line is language is really important. And therefore, that's what makes this so alluring, and that's what makes this so beguiling, because we see something behaving with language the way that artificial, technologies have never been able to behave with language. On the other hand, though, there does seem to be a fundamental disconnect. There does seem to be mere pattern recognition, and that's not what our linguistic capability is, right?
Right.
And so we just want to be careful about being beguiled, being tricked by the facility with language that these machines seem to have,
Right.
and understand the fundamental difference in our own language, and learn to appreciate our capability, our facility with language all the more.
Right. So, and not to skip back up to the doom part of all of this that we've been talking about the last episode, but when you talk about artificial intelligence in schools, you've got these new processes in place that are instructing children on language and models of language and what these things mean, and making sure that you're assigning the word tree to actual trees. But when you have an artificial intelligence that's not that differential and doesn't necessarily have that truth telling obligation, then where does that leave us? Because you're being instructed by a thing that doesn't have that same type of I don't know, what would you call that, Joe? Is that a moral or maybe more of an ethical concern that you're telling the truth, or that you're assigning the right word to a thing?
Yeah, I think it is ethical and moral. I think that so this relates to sort of one of the other sort of problems that I think we should just give pause to. We should think through, without sounding hopefully too much like a rigorist here. But if you read back in the tradition, if you read great spiritual masters, or moral theologians, Thomas Aquinas, um, anyone in the monastic tradition, if you read, for example, letters that were written from monks, saints that were monks, for like 1800 years of church history, one of the biggest concerns was idle speech, right?
Mm.
And if you just think about the inundation of information, and yes, this goes beyond AI, to be sure, right? But we've gotten so far away from this sort of valuing and prizing of this thing that we do that no other creature, no other material creature does, which is communicate. We truly communicate. We can express things. We can express our heart and soul. We can express praise to God. We can, there's something very deeply meaningful about the act of speaking, of representation. And we shouldn't take that for granted, and we should also kind of reverence it. Not to say, I don't want to exaggerate on the other extreme and say that, therefore use of these things is quasi blasphemous or sacrilegious. But what I do want to say is that our, we have to take responsibility for this, and there is something a little bit shady, a little bit weird about taking words that you didn't create, that you maybe haven't even bothered to read yourself, and then putting them out there as a communication as though from yourself.
Hmm.
And the minimum level of let's say, care that we should definitely be taking over that is to make sure that it doesn't communicate anything we don't want to say.
Yeah.
But simply kind of signing off on the expression at the end of the process. I'm not saying there's not times and places that use case can be appropriate. Ghostwriters and things like that already exist, so this isn't kind of a new phenomenon on that front. However, the extent to which we denature, we just need to think about this. Like, think of how many times you're writing a text message and the autocomplete is there and you're just clicking the next word. You're not even bothering, and to what extent does this then get us habituated into not thinking before we speak, not thinking, not giving people the respect they deserve as our interlocutors, as our audience, if we have an audience, by really, showing them that act of respect, that act of charity that another intelligence made in the image and likeness of God deserves from us, right? So again, I don't want to sound holier than thou on this, but I do have strong feelings about, we offer each other this pablum of copy pasta as though it's like, good, and it's not. It's not. It's not the same thing as, I think I used the example at our summit conference, at the CSN Summit workshop, where we were speaking about AI, that if a teenager is having trouble getting this, ask somebody, like, if you received a love note from your beau, from your boyfriend or girlfriend, and it was written completely by AI, would that mean as much to you if they wrote it out? Probably not. I think we know this stuff intuitively, but we need to just think about it a little more as we engage with these tools.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking of something. I don't want to get too preachy on that, but my kids can send me a text message, and I know right away that it's my kids. And if my wife sends me a text message, I know that that's my wife, because I know their voice. I know how they're, I know how they talk. I know how they speak. And I think that's an interesting thing for people to think about, is as you're having AI maybe, rewriting emails, rewriting, essays or whatever it is, and it's not in your personal voice, how is that distancing us from our own voice? And, just kind of thinking about that verse from John, where it's, talking about, do you hear, you hear my voice? We know the master's voice, and how that's kind of distancing us, maybe even spiritually, Joe, in this day and age where things are so automated, to where we're not even able to differentiate whether or not that email was something that you wrote or something that AI wrote, and maybe it doesn't even matter. But maybe that's something interesting to think about as well, as we're going through this. Is how is that affecting us spiritually? Because our voice is a very important part of, I think, what makes us individual humans.
Well, and I'll throw a bone here of a sort to the people that maybe think that we're on a high horse, but it's going to be a paradoxical one, right? If people say, like, oh, you're picking on this, I want to pick up on something that you just said, where you said about, can we tell this email is from you or not from you, and does it even matter? I think
Right.
that question is actually more important, and that's the question. Just like in the last episode when I said that anthropologically in the 20th century and a little bit before, something changed in the way that we view the human person. Something changed in the way that we view man and his work and what he does that allowed for the then social changes to adapt around. And I think it's here too. We have taken a certain view towards truth telling, towards what it means to communicate to one another, what it means to listen to one another, what it means, the value that we place on that. And part of this is just because we're so inundated with it. We're so inundated with messages, with text.
Yeah.
You know, I have this library behind me, and I often get questions as people either walk into this room or they see me on camera and they say like, "Oh, have you read all these books?" And I say no. I'm gonna try my darndest.
It's a process.
I want to work through as many of them as possible. But it occurred to me one day when I was sitting in here and somebody asked that question for like the umpteenth time, and they in asking and me in responding, we both seem to have this presumption that it's nigh impossible to do. And then I realized, honestly, in this day and age, I probably encounter and consume as much text as is in this entire room in a single year.
Yeah.
Because we're just so inundated by it. Text is everywhere, except the problem is it's mostly meaningless. It's mostly useless. So, so to that end, dear listeners, it does. There is a chicken and the egg thing here, and I don't want to come down so hard on saying don't use AI for those tasks like writing an email, when we're kind of begging the question of the value of that email in the first place.
Sure.
So maybe we all need to just be a little more quiet in our lives, and maybe we need a little less stimulation and less content. And I say this, here we are, we're, I guess, for the time being anyway, content creators, and we're making more stuff, but we know that this is a problem of modern life. And, I would be the first person to tell you if this podcast distracts you, if it troubles you, if it steals your peace, if you find that you have to get to it and it's just another thing in your day, turn it off. Turn off your phone, throw your phone in the river, and go, and touch grass. Right? I would much rather you do that. But if you have the wherewithal and you're a podcast consumer anyway, then sure, I'd rather you listen to Lee and I and hear a little bit of Chesterton and what the Catholic Church has to say than to just consume 3 hours of Joe Rogan talking about Bigfoot. So, it's a balance.
Yeah. So, and you kind of brought in the idea of entertainment there and leisure time and things like that. And so that's something that we know that Rerum Novarum actually addressed as well. And the importance and kind of talking about, again, your hypothesis here on just the amount of data that we're consuming. And I think as humans, we've learned to be as frugal as possible with our time and with our energy. And so when we see a new tool like artificial intelligence saying, "Hey, I can just write that essay for you," it's like, well, absolutely. Why would I waste my time when this doesn't really matter in the end? And so, again, a really good thought process. When you're talking about the books behind you, Joe, I just thought, what dost thou read, my lord? Words, words, words. And we can leave it at that. No. So this is an interesting, it's good. So part 2, again, we're talking, do we need a Rerum Novarum? I think we're both agreeing that we absolutely do need Rerum Novarum part 2 that addresses this new emerging technology and how we're supposed to handle it and how we're supposed to grapple with some of these questions that Joe and I are hypothesizing around. And let me ask you this, Joe, as we kind of wrap things up here. I asked you in part 1 what the Chestertonian response would be, and how should we handle that. So what would your response be now? We've talked about this kind of philosophical, ethical, moral approaches to these things, and some interesting thought experiments that we should be, that we should keep at the forefront of our minds as we're using this technology. But where does this leave us, and where would you take us? Either in a Chestertonian slant or another way.
Yeah, well, thank you for the setup, and very adroitly done. I appreciate it. And Lee knows where I'm going with this, but I always come back to a particular poem by T.S. Eliot on this, and I encourage everyone to look it up. It was originally a libretta for an opera called The Rock, and this is the poetry collection is Choruses from the Rock. And so this is a little lengthy, but bear with me, and I think you'll understand why these conversations remind me of that. And once again, this is not about so-called artificial intelligence. This is, and in the last episode when I said we we probably do need another Rerum Novarum, if you listened closely, you will have noticed that I said it was the computer age. It was the computer age moment that we went through all these epical transformations in the 20th century, but the digital age kind of came upon us, and we were still sort of, and needfully so, we were still sort of fighting these older battles about blocks of power and nuclear weapons and everything else that was so existentially threatening, that this kind of snuck in under the radar, and it took over our lives very, very quickly, and to the extent that, within living memory, within my lifetime, the changes that have taken place have just been gigantic, similar to, in a shorter time frame than in Leo the 13th's life. We talked about him being born before there was photography and ending up on a moving picture.
Right.
I spent time in high school talking to a phone that was tethered to the wall, and that was the only option you had to do that. And then within a few short years, I'm sending text messages and doing other things on this mobile device. So anyway, this is from Choruses from the Rock, and just take a listen, and then we'll chat about it a little bit at the end and wrap up here. But Eliot writes, "The eagle soars in the summit of heaven. The hunter with his dogs pursues his circuit. O perpetual revolution of configured stars, O perpetual recurrence of determined seasons, O world of spring and autumn, birth and dying, the endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness, knowledge of speech, but not of silence, knowledge of words, and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. All our ignorance brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death, no nearer to God. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? The cycles of heaven in 20 centuries brings us farther from God and nearer to the dust." And then there's a little break in the poem, and it continues, "The lot of man is ceaseless labor, or ceaseless idleness, which is still harder, or irregular labor, which is not pleasant. I have trodden the winepress alone, and I know that it is hard to be really useful, resigning the things that men count for happiness, seeking the good deeds that lead to obscurity, accepting with equal face those that bring ignominy, the applause of all or the love of none. All men are ready to invest their money, but most expect dividends. I say to you, make perfect your will. I say, take no thought of the harvest, but only of proper sowing. The world turns and the world changes, but one thing does not change. In all of my years, one thing does not change. However you disguise it, this thing does not change. The perpetual struggle of good and evil. Forgetful, you neglect your shrines and churches. The men you are in these times deride what has been done of good. You find explanations to satisfy the rational and enlightened mind. Second, you neglect and belittle the desert. The desert is not remote in southern tropics. The desert is not only around the corner. The desert is squeezed in the tube train next to you. The desert is in the heart of your brother. The good man is the builder, if he builds what is good. I will show you the things that are now being done, and some of the things that were not long ago done, that you may take heart. Make perfect your will. Let me show you the work of the humble. Listen." And that's the rock speaking in the poem. Fantastic poem. The part that really gets me every time is that where's the life we've lost in living? Where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge we've lost in information? And I think that a great capstone to our conversation that we've been having here is precisely that the difference between these machines and us at the end of the day, and what we lose to the extent that we're engaged with these machines, is precisely that. It's knowledge over mere information. Like on the last episode, Lee, we talked about smarts versus intelligence.
Right.
Knowing all the facts, knowing all the things, having an amassed catalog of mere information is not knowledge, much less understanding, far, far much less wisdom. So just something we need to think about.
Yeah, fantastic, Joe. Thanks for reading that. It's kind of a fantastic medicine for where we see ourselves today. This was a great part two. I hope we can have some further conversations and dive into what we see happening hopefully soon from Pope Leo XIV and anything from the church that would address the day and age that we live. But I think this has been a really good couple of episodes that we've done, Joe. Really fruitful for me as well to kind of hear your thought process on things and dive into the moral and ethical side of the technology. So really appreciate, again, the effort that you've put into this and the conversations, and looking forward to more in the future.
I am as well, and thank you, Lee, for kind of helping guide the discussion, keeping me on task for sure. And to the viewers and listeners, do make sure you're subscribed. Share this with your friends. Go back and rewatch and re-engage with some of the stuff that we've been thinking through, because these are hard issues, and we want to be an aid to that. But moving forward in the future too, I hope what you can expect from us here, it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all even just sort of analysis and warnings. Part of the thing that we love about Chesterton is not only was he a prophet in the sense of being able to kind of predict the future and being able to kind of warn against the evils of his day and of our day, but also by his holiness of life to witness to us the better ways of how to be joyful, how to be, how to be that quintessentially joyful Christian that Chesterton was. We need more than ever that in our world today, because these things do get a little bit heavy sometimes. And gosh, if he were here, he'd be railing against it and yet carrying it all off with a lightheartedness and a joy and a joke and a smile on his face. And we need to show both of those sides, I think.
Absolutely. And just as a reminder too, if you enjoyed these podcasts, make sure that you're sharing it with friends or family, because like we say a lot around here, Chesterton is better with friends. Thanks again, Joe, so much for your time, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
God bless.